This is the story of Joshua, a man who learned that victory comes from trusting God's presence more than our own strength. Once upon a time, under a velvet sky full of stars, Joshua sat alone by the riverbank. The water shimmered in the moonlight, whispering around the stones like a quiet song. Joshua held a smooth rock in his hand, turning it over and over. He wasn't a young warrior anymore. His face was lined from years under the sun, and his arms bore scars from many battles. But tonight, his heart felt as shaky as a boy's. Behind him, the people of Israel slept in their tents. Tomorrow, they would cross the Jordan River. Tomorrow, they would step into the Promised Land. Joshua closed his eyes, breathing in the cool night air. "Moses, how did you do it?" he whispered. "How did you stand so strong when the people were afraid? How did you trust God when it all seemed impossible?" He remembered his days as a young assistant, standing close to Moses, watching him stretch out his staff over the Red Sea. Joshua had seen water split like a giant doorway. He had seen manna fall from the sky like morning snow. But Moses was gone now, and God had chosen Joshua to lead. Joshua pressed the rock against his forehead. "God," he prayed softly, "I know you promised to be with me. But these people, they're counting on me. What if I fail them?" A sudden breeze brushed his face, almost like a gentle hand. He looked up sharply, heart racing. In the silence of the night, he felt it, not just the wind, but God's presence, strong and steady, like a mountain standing behind him. "Be strong and courageous." A quiet voice seemed to echo inside his chest. "I will never leave you or forsake you." Joshua's fingers tightened around the rock. Slowly he stood up, his back straightening. He looked across the river where the land waited like a giant promise. "All right, God," he whispered, a small smile starting to grow on his face. "I'll trust you. I'll lead them. But you have to go before me." He slipped the rock into his pocket and turned back toward the tents, feeling a new kind of strength flow through his tired muscles. Tonight he felt more than just a commander or a soldier. He felt chosen. Not because he was the strongest, but because God was with him. And that was more powerful than any sword or shield he could ever hold. Joshua marched back toward the camp with long, steady strides. As he moved, the early sunlight turned the whole valley golden, and he could see families stepping out of tents, stretching and rubbing their eyes. A few young boys chased each other, pretending to be soldiers. Old women stirred pots over small fires, and men looked up squinting when they saw Joshua coming. He climbed a large rock in the center of camp so everyone could see him. His heart thudded hard in his chest, but he stood tall. "People of Israel," Joshua called, his voice echoing across the camp like a drumbeat. "Come close and listen." A hush fell as the crowd moved in. Fathers lifted children onto their shoulders, and mothers held babies close. Every eye turned to him. Joshua took a deep breath. "Tomorrow," he said, pointing toward the river, "we will cross the Jordan. We will enter the land the Lord promised us, the land our parents and grandparents only dreamed about." A ripple of gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. Some faces glowed with excitement, others tightened in fear. Joshua raised his hands to quiet them. "You have seen what God has done," he continued firmly. "You saw him feed us in the wilderness. You saw him bring water from rocks. You saw his cloud guide us by day and his fire by night. And now you will see him make a way through this mighty river." He turned to the priest standing nearby, holding the Ark of the Covenant, the golden chest that carried the tablets of God's law, the holiest item they owned. "Priests," Joshua said, "tomorrow you will carry the ark ahead of us. When you step into the river, the waters will stop, and the whole nation will follow after you on dry ground." The priests looked at each other, eyes wide. One of them, an older man with a white beard, stepped forward slowly. "Joshua, the river is strong and deep right now," he said, voice trembling a little. "Are you sure?" Joshua nodded, his eyes shining. "Not because of my strength, because of God's presence." The old priest pressed his lips together, then finally nodded. A young girl in the crowd turned to her mother. "Mama," she whispered loudly, "will God really stop the river?" Her mother didn't answer right away. She looked up at Joshua, her eyes filling with tears. Finally, she knelt and pulled her daughter close. "Yes," she said softly, "He has never failed us yet." Joshua stepped down from the rock, moving among the people, touching shoulders and lifting faces. "Prepare your hearts tonight," he said gently as he passed. "Tomorrow, God will do wonders among us." As he moved through the crowd, he felt the energy shift, fear melting into hope, worry turning into wonder. That night, while campfires flickered under the starry sky, the people talked in low, excited voices. Parents whispered stories of past miracles to their children. Warriors sharpened their swords, not because they trusted their blades more, but because they believed God would go before them. Joshua stood at the edge of camp, looking again toward the dark line of the Jordan. In his heart, he felt a calm certainty rise like a quiet sunrise. Tomorrow, everything would change. The first rays of morning stretched across the valley like golden fingers. Birds chirped from nearby trees, and a light mist rose off the Jordan River. Joshua stood at the edge of camp, watching as families packed up tents and tied bundles onto their backs. Children clung to their parents, eyes wide and sparkling with excitement and fear. The priests gathered near the Ark of the Covenant, adjusting their robes and gripping the poles that held the golden chest. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting to the roaring, fast-moving river ahead. Joshua stepped forward, his sandals brushing the damp grass. He looked each priest in the eye, pausing for a moment to let his words sink deep. "Today," he said, "God will show you that He is with us. When you step into the Jordan, the waters will stop. Don't look at the river, look at Him." The lead priest swallowed hard and nodded, his hands trembling just a little as he adjusted his grip. A young boy standing nearby squeezed his father's hand. "Papa," he whispered, "will we really walk on dry ground?" His father knelt and smiled, though his voice shook. "Yes, my son, the God who split the Red Sea will split this river too." Joshua raised his arm high, signaling the priests forward. Slowly, step by careful step, they moved toward the rushing water. The crowd held their breath, everyone frozen in place. When the first priest's foot touched the edge of the river, something incredible happened. The loud, churning current suddenly trembled and slowed. The water upstream piled up into a tall, shimmering wall, while the water downstream flowed away until the riverbed lay bare and dry, covered in smooth stones and patches of mud. A gasp rippled through the entire crowd. Mothers hugged their children tighter, and men dropped to their knees in awe. The priest stood in the middle of the riverbed, holding the ark steady. The sunlight glinted off the gold, making it glow like a beacon. Joshua stepped forward onto the dry stones, feeling the mud squish lightly under his sandals. His eyes welled up with tears. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, his voice catching. "Thank you for going before us." He turned and shouted to the people, "Come, cross over. Today we walk into God's promise." With cautious steps at first, families began moving forward. Little children giggled, stomping in the muddy spots, while elders leaned on their staffs, eyes shining with wonder. One woman reached down and picked up a smooth stone from the riverbed, holding it close to her chest. "A reminder," she whispered to her daughter, "so we never forget what God did today." Joshua watched as thousands crossed, his heart pounding with gratitude and pride. He had waited so long for this day, not just to win battles, but to see a whole nation finally step into freedom and promise. As the last families passed, he looked back at the standing wall of water and the priests waiting patiently in the center. And he knew, deeper than ever before, that victory had nothing to do with his sword or his plans. It all came from God's presence leading the way. As the last of the people reached the far bank, Joshua raised his hand to stop them. "Wait," he called out, his voice strong and echoing across the dry riverbed. "Before we move on, we must remember what God has done today." The people turned, their faces curious. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, and warriors rested on their spears, waiting to hear more. Joshua chose 12 strong men from the different tribes and pointed back to the riverbed where the priests still stood, holding the ark. "Go back," he commanded, "and each of you pick up one large stone from the middle of the Jordan, from where the priests are standing. Put them on your shoulders and carry them out." The men looked at each other, eyes wide. One by one, they stepped carefully back onto the dry ground and began lifting heavy, smooth stones. Sweat rolled down their foreheads, but their eyes shone with excitement. Each man held his stone close, knowing it wasn't just a rock. It was a memory they would pass on to their children and grandchildren. When they returned, they laid the stones in a pile at the edge of the new camp. Joshua stood beside them, resting his hand on the topmost stone. "These stones," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "will be a sign among you. When your children ask, 'What do these stones mean?' you will tell them how the Lord stopped the Jordan for us to cross, so that all people will know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you may always fear and trust him." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Parents pulled their children close, pointing to the stones and whispering the story already. Then Joshua turned back to the river. He signaled to the priests who slowly carried the ark out of the riverbed. As soon as their feet touched the bank, the wall of water roared back into place, crashing and swirling like it had never stopped at all. A hush fell over the people as they watched the river rise and rush again. Joshua looked out over the crowd. "Today," he said, his eyes blazing, "we saw God do what no man could. Tomorrow we will face the cities and armies ahead, but do not be afraid. God goes before us, and he alone gives us victory." That night, as fires flickered across the camp, families sat together telling the story over and over, tracing their fingers along the smooth stones, feeling the cool, solid proof of God's power. Joshua sat alone for a while, looking at the stars above the quiet camp. He remembered the first time he saw the land as a young spy, dreaming of this moment. Tomorrow they would face Jericho, a city with walls as high as the sky. But tonight, Joshua felt a deep calm, the kind that only comes when you know you aren't walking alone. He closed his eyes and whispered into the darkness, "Thank you, Lord. You are the true warrior. You are our victory." The next morning, A thin mist hung over the land, curling around the tents and drifting over the camp like a quiet blanket. Joshua rose before sunrise and walked ahead of the camp alone. In the distance, the walls of Jericho rose high and strong, gleaming in the early light. They looked like giant stone cliffs, impossible to climb or break. Joshua stopped at the edge of a hill and crouched low, studying the city carefully. He could see guards pacing along the top of the walls and hear the faint clank of armor. He felt a tightness in his chest. He could almost hear the doubting voices of the old spies years ago. The walls are too strong. The giants too fierce. Joshua clenched his fists. God, we're here now, he whispered. But these walls, I don't know how we can do this. Suddenly, he felt a strong presence behind him. He spun around quickly, hand on his sword. A man stood there, holding a large sword, his face glowing with a strength and calm Joshua had never seen before. Joshua's eyes widened. "Are you for us or for our enemies?" he demanded, his voice firm but unsure. The man's eyes met his steadily. "Neither," he answered. "I am the commander of the Lord's army. I have now come." Joshua's mouth dropped open. Without another word, he fell face down on the ground. "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" he asked, his voice trembling in the dirt. The commander's voice was steady like the roar of a strong river. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." Joshua obeyed immediately, slipping off his sandals and pressing his forehead to the ground. A warm peace washed over him, stronger than any armor he had ever worn. Then the commander spoke again. "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands. You and your fighting men will march around the city once each day for 6 days. On the 7th day, march around it 7 times, and the priests will blow their trumpets. When you hear a long blast, all the people will give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will fall down flat." Joshua looked up slowly, eyes wide. "March, trumpets, shout. No ladders, no battering rams, no swords." He swallowed hard, a nervous laugh bubbling up in his chest. That's it? That's the plan?" The commander didn't answer. He only looked at Joshua with eyes that burned with heavenly power. Joshua stood, sandals still in his hand, heart pounding wildly. "It's not my strength," he whispered to himself. "It's God's presence. That's all we need." Joshua nodded firmly. "Yes, Lord, we will obey." He slipped his sandals back on and ran back toward camp, every step kicking up small clouds of dust. As he ran, he felt his fear peeling away, replaced by a burning excitement. The God who split the sea and the river would tear down those walls too. And when he returned to camp, he knew exactly what he had to tell the people, even if the plan sounded impossible. Joshua burst back into camp, breathing hard but smiling wide. His eyes gleamed like sunlight on water. People turned to stare as he ran past, calling for the priests and the leaders. Children followed, giggling and curious, until a big crowd had gathered around him. Jethro, one of his old warrior friends, stepped forward first. "Joshua," he panted, "what did you see out there? What's the plan? We're ready to fight." Joshua raised his hands for silence. The crowd hushed instantly. He looked at them one by one, at the strong young soldiers gripping their spears, at the mothers holding their babies close, at the old men leaning on staffs. "Listen carefully," Joshua said, his voice strong and calm. "God has given Jericho into our hands, but we will not fight in the way you expect." The soldiers shifted, confused. One young man furrowed his brow. "Not fight? But How will we take the walls down?" Joshua took a deep breath. "We will march around the city once each day for 6 days. The priests will carry the Ark of the Covenant, and 7 priests will blow trumpets in front of it. On the 7th day we will march 7 times. Then, when the priests give a long blast, we will all shout as loud as we can, and God himself will make the walls fall." Silence spread through the crowd like a wave. Some men looked at each other, blinking. A few mouths hung open. A boy near the front gasped, "March and shout? That's all?" Jethro stepped closer, scratching his head. "Joshua, are you serious? No swords? No ladders? No battering rams?" Joshua nodded. "God wants us to trust him, not our weapons. He wants us to know the battle is his." Slowly, the confusion turned to murmurs of wonder. An older woman raised her hands toward heaven and began to weep softly. Finally, Jethro lowered his spear and smiled. "If God said it, then I believe it," he declared. The people started nodding and murmuring in agreement. The young boy from before jumped up and down, yelling, "We're going to shout the walls down! We're going to shout the walls down!" Joshua laughed, feeling his heart lift. He turned to the priests. "Prepare the ark," he said. "Gather your trumpets. Tomorrow we march." That evening, the camp buzzed with energy. People cooked quietly, telling each other stories about the Red Sea and the Jordan River. Children made up songs about marching and shouting. Joshua sat by a small fire, staring into the flames. He could almost see the walls of Jericho already falling in his mind. He closed his eyes and prayed silently. "Thank you, God, for this plan. Even when it doesn't make sense to us, help us trust that your ways always lead to victory." When he finally opened his eyes, the stars shimmered above, and the night felt alive with hope. Tomorrow they would march, not in their own strength, but with God's presence leading every step. At sunrise, the camp buzzed with nervous energy. Joshua moved through the people, checking the lines, making sure every tribe was in place. The priests stood ready, gripping the golden poles of the ark. 7 priests held their curved ram's horns, their eyes fixed on Joshua. Children peeked out from behind their mothers, whispering excitedly. Warriors bounced on their toes, gripping their swords even though they knew they wouldn't need them today. Joshua stepped forward and raised his hand. "Today, we obey," he called, his voice echoing across the valley. "We march in silence. No shouts, no noise, except the trumpets. We trust that God fights for us." The people nodded, swallowing their nerves. The priests lifted the ark, its gold shimmering in the early light. The 7 priests holding the trumpets began to walk, each step slow and steady. The ark followed, and then the armed men and all the people behind. They marched down the hill toward Jericho, where the massive walls loomed ahead like a stone giant. From the top of the walls, Jericho's guards watched, eyes wide. Warriors inside the city ran along the walls, peeking over, shouting to each other. "What are they doing?" one guard yelled. "Why aren't they attacking?" "They're just walking," another called, scratching his head. Inside the city, people pressed against the walls, terrified and confused. Mothers grabbed their children, pulling them deeper into houses. Soldiers fumbled with their swords, not sure whether to fight or hide. Around and around the city, Joshua led the people. The trumpets echoed off the walls, a haunting, steady sound like a heartbeat in the air. Not a single Israelite spoke. No battle cries, no chants. Just the soft crunch of sandals on dirt and the long, low wail of the horns. As they completed the circle, they marched back to camp without a single word. Once they reached their tents, the people finally breathed out. Some collapsed onto the ground, hearts pounding from the tension. Others hugged each other, laughing with relief and surprise. Jethro hurried to Joshua, his eyes huge. "That was the strangest battle I've ever been part of," he whispered, "but I feel like something big is coming." Joshua nodded, his face calm but determined. "This isn't about us scaring them with swords. It's about showing them who God really is." That night, families sat around small fires, whispering about the day. Children mimicked the trumpet sounds while elders reminded them, "We must wait. We must trust." Joshua looked up at the stars, thinking of the next day and the days to come. 7 days. 7 chances to show that victory doesn't come from strength or noise, but from God's presence and promise. As he drifted to sleep, he felt a strange peace settle in his chest. Tomorrow they would do it again, and each step would bring them closer to the miracle they couldn't yet see, but fully believed was coming. The next morning, the sun rose over the valley in a pale orange glow. The people stirred from their tents quietly, no loud chatter or laughter, just focused, steady preparation. Joshua stood at the edge of the camp, watching the priests gather around the ark and adjust their robes. The 7 priests with trumpets checked the curves of their horns, each one taking a slow breath. Jethro approached, wiping sweat from his forehead even before the march began. "Day 2, he said with a weak laugh. "I thought maybe we'd be fighting by now, but we're still walking." Joshua turned to him, eyes steady. "We are fighting, just not with swords," he said. "Our silence is our trust. Our march is our obedience. Every step is a blow to the enemy's pride." Jethro nodded slowly, though his eyes still darted toward the towering walls of Jericho in the distance. Joshua raised his hand, signaling the priests. The trumpets lifted, and the steady, mournful wail started again. They began moving, single file at first, then tightening around the ark. The people fell in behind, sandals brushing the dusty ground, eyes locked on the walls ahead. When they approached Jericho, guards once again leaned over the edge, confusion and fear on their faces. On the second day, some guards shouted insults down at them. "You think you can scare us with horns and marching? You look like lost sheep." But the Israelites didn't respond. Not a single word, just the deep, echoing sound of the trumpets and the soft rhythm of footsteps. Day after day, they repeated the march. On the 3rd day, the people inside Jericho started barricading doors and stacking supplies, eyes wide and terrified. On the 4th day, a few guards threw rocks over the walls, but the Israelites just kept marching in perfect silence. By the 5th and 6th days, the people inside the city could barely watch anymore. Windows slammed shut, doors creaked closed, and children inside covered their ears against the trumpet blasts. Back at the camp each evening, the Israelites would finally let out their breath, shaking from the tension. Mothers hugged their children tight. Fathers patted each other's shoulders, trying to hide their own nervousness. Joshua sat by his fire each night looking into the flames. He repeated the same words in his heart like a heartbeat. Trust him. Trust his plan. Trust his presence. On the 6th night, as he drifted off to sleep, he dreamed of the walls of Jericho crumbling like dry clay, dust flying into the sunrise. When he woke before dawn on the 7th day, he felt it in his bones. Tomorrow, the shout comes. Before the first light of dawn, Joshua rose and walked through the silent camp. The air felt thick with expectation, like a storm about to break. He watched families packing up quickly, tightening belts, tying sandals, checking that children stayed close. There was no laughter today, only wide eyes and shallow breaths. Joshua found the priests standing by the ark, gripping the poles tight. The 7 trumpet bearers stood nearby, their horns glowing softly in the gray morning light. Joshua took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Today," he said, his voice calm but strong, "we do something different. We will march around the city 7 times, and when we finish, you will blow your trumpets one long blast. Then we all shout together, with everything we have." The priests exchanged nervous glances but nodded. One younger priest swallowed hard and whispered, "And then the walls will fall?" Joshua looked him straight in the eyes, his own gaze blazing. "Yes," he said firmly, "because God promised." Jethro stepped forward too, shifting his feet nervously. 7 times? That's a lot of walking," he said with a shaky laugh. Joshua managed a small smile. "Our feet are doing the walking, but God is doing the fighting." The signal was given. The trumpets started their deep, echoing wail, and the people moved forward step by step. On the first lap, guards peered over the walls, pale and silent. By the third lap, even the soldiers inside had stopped jeering. Some simply crouched behind the battlements, eyes darting from side to side. By the 5th lap, sweat dripped down the Israelites' faces. Their feet were sore, but their eyes stayed locked on the ark. Mothers carried tired children. Old men leaned on staffs, but no one turned back. On the 7th lap, tension tightened like a pulled bowstring. People's hands curled into fists, their breath quickened. Hearts pounded so loudly they could barely hear the trumpets. Finally, as they completed the 7th circle, Joshua raised his hand high. The priests lifted their trumpets to their lips and let out one long, echoing blast that rolled over the city like thunder. Joshua turned, his voice fierce and alive. "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." A roar exploded from the people, louder than any battle cry ever heard in the land. Warriors shouted until their throats burned. Mothers and children screamed out. Elders lifted their hands and cried to the sky. The ground trembled. Cracks split across the giant stone walls, dust flew high into the air, and with a deafening rumble, the mighty walls of Jericho crumbled and fell flat like a kicked-down sandcastle. The people stood in stunned silence for a moment, eyes wide, mouths hanging open. Then they surged forward, pouring into the city like a mighty wave, claiming what God had promised them. Joshua stood at the front, tears running down his cheeks, his voice barely a whisper. "Not by our strength," he said, "but by your power alone." As the dust settled and the last stones tumbled to the ground, the people of Israel rushed forward into the city. Joshua lifted his sword high, calling to the warriors as they charged in. "Remember the Lord's command. Everything belongs to him. No treasures for ourselves. Only Rahab and her family are to be spared." The people nodded, their faces set with determination. They moved through the city carefully but swiftly, making sure to obey every detail God had given. Meanwhile, Rahab and her family waited inside her small house on the wall. The red cord hung from her window, bright and fluttering in the morning breeze. When the Israelite soldiers reached her door, they stopped and knocked gently. "Come out," one of them called. "You are safe. Joshua has commanded it." Rahab stepped forward, trembling, her eyes wide with wonder. She looked back at her family, then at the fallen city around them. "God truly saved us," she whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. The soldiers led her and her family out of the city and guided them to a safe place outside the camp. Back inside Jericho, the people worked together, burning idols and clearing away anything God had forbidden them to keep. There was no greedy grabbing for gold, no fighting over treasures. Joshua stood in the center of the ruins, watching as families moved together, heads high. Instead of chaos, there was an almost holy quiet, a shared understanding that this victory was not theirs to claim. Jethro appeared at Joshua's side, wiping sweat and dust from his face. "I still can't believe it," he panted. "Those walls, they just fell." Joshua laughed softly, shaking his head. "When God fights for us, the impossible becomes normal," he said. Jethro chuckled, clapping Joshua's shoulder. "You were right, old friend. It wasn't about our strength at all." As the sun rose higher, the people gathered near Joshua. Their eyes sparkled, and smiles spread across tired faces. Children played among the broken stones, pretending to blow trumpets and topple invisible walls. Joshua looked out over the crowd and lifted his hands. "Today, we saw with our own eyes that victory belongs to the Lord," he called out. "Never forget it. When you see enemies or giants in the future, remember Jericho. Remember this day." A great shout of agreement rose from the people. Mothers hugged their children close, and fathers lifted their arms toward the sky. As the day drew to a close, fires crackled softly around the camp, and people shared simple meals. They talked in low voices, their stories already turning into legends that would be told for generations. Joshua sat alone for a moment, staring at the horizon beyond the broken walls. He knew there were more battles ahead, more challenges waiting. But tonight, as the stars blinked awake above him, he felt peace deep in his bones. Victory had come. Not because of mighty swords or clever plans, but because they trusted God's presence above their own strength. The morning after Jericho's victory, the camp stirred early. A soft mist hovered over the fields, and dew sparkled on every blade of grass. Joshua stood at the edge of camp, watching the people move quietly. Warriors checked their gear, mothers packed bundles, and children ran around, still full of energy after yesterday's miracle. Jethro joined him, adjusting the strap on his sword. "So, where to next?" he asked, squinting into the distance. Joshua took a slow breath. "Aye," he said firmly. "It's smaller than Jericho. Should be easy. But we must not forget who fights for us." Jethro nodded but smiled confidently. "Compared to Jericho, this will be like chasing goats." Joshua turned sharply, his eyes serious. "It's not about the size of the city, Jethro. If we rely on ourselves, even the smallest battle will defeat us." Jethro's grin faded. He nodded slowly, understanding. When scouts returned from Ai, they reported, "It's a small city. We only need a few thousand men. Don't trouble the whole army." Joshua agreed and sent out a small force. But when they attacked Ai, the Israelites were chased back down the hills in panic. 36 men died that day, and fear spread through the camp like a wildfire. The people sat in shock, faces pale and heads lowered. Joshua fell face down before the ark, tearing his clothes and pouring dust on his head. "Lord!" he cried out, his voice raw. "Why did you bring us here to be defeated? What will people say about your great name?" God spoke firmly to Joshua's heart. "Stand up! Israel has sinned. They took what I told them not to take from Jericho. You must get rid of the sin among you before you can stand against your enemies." Joshua rose, his body trembling, but his mind clear. He called the people together and searched tribe by tribe until Achan, a soldier, stood before him. Achan dropped to his knees, head bowed low. "I have sinned," he confessed, voice small and shaky. "I took silver, gold, and a beautiful robe. I hid them in my tent." Joshua felt a sharp pain in his heart. He turned to the people. "We cannot win if we hide sin. We must be pure before the Lord." After Achan's punishment, the people's hearts were heavy, but their fear of God grew stronger. Joshua gathered them again. "We will not be defeated by enemies outside if we keep our hearts clean inside," he said, his voice ringing clear. The next day, Joshua led the full army against Ai. With God's guidance, they set a clever trap, drew Ai's soldiers out of the city, and then captured it completely. This time, victory was clear and certain. When the battle was done, the people built an altar to God and offered thanks. Joshua read aloud all the words of God's law, reminding them of his promises and warnings. As families listened, heads bowed and hearts open, they realized that every victory and every loss depended on their faithfulness. Joshua looked out at the people, feeling their eyes on him. He knew more cities and battles lay ahead, but he also knew that as long as they trusted God's presence, they would never truly be defeated. With Ai defeated, word spread quickly through the land. Kings from nearby cities started to whisper to each other, eyes wide with fear. Jericho fell without a single stone left standing, one king said, his voice shaking. And now Ai is gone too. Another king slammed his fist on a table. Their God fights for them. We need to join forces or we're next. Joshua, meanwhile, continued leading Israel from city to city. The people marched behind him faithfully, their hearts stronger than ever before. In one city after another, they saw walls crumble, armies scatter, and enemies surrender. Not because they had the biggest weapons or the strongest warriors, but because they carried God's promise in front of them like a blazing torch. One day, a group of strangers arrived at Joshua's camp. Their clothes were dusty and torn, and their sandals were worn out. They carried moldy bread and old wineskins. "We have come from a far country," the men said, bowing low. "Make a treaty with us so we may live." Joshua and the leaders looked at each other. The strangers looked weak and harmless. Jethro leaned in and whispered, "They look harmless enough, right? Let's just agree." But Joshua frowned and looked around, noticing the moldy bread and old clothes. He felt a tug inside, a quiet warning. Still, instead of asking God first, Joshua and the leaders agreed to make peace. They shook hands and promised not to attack. A few days later, scouts returned in a rush. "Joshua," one shouted, "these men didn't come from far away. They live right here in the land. The Gibeonites. They tricked us." Joshua's face fell. He felt the sting of the mistake deep in his heart. He called the Gibeonites forward. "Why did you lie to us?" he demanded. The Gibeonites bowed low. "We heard of your God," they admitted. "We knew he would give you this land, and we feared for our lives." Joshua sighed heavily. "We gave our word. We cannot destroy you, but you will serve as woodcutters and water carriers for God's house." The people grumbled about the deception, but Joshua raised his hand to quiet them. "This is why we must always ask God first," he told them firmly. "Our eyes can be fooled, but God's wisdom never fails." That night, Joshua sat alone by a fire, watching the sparks dance into the starry sky. He thought of every battle, every promise, every moment he had felt strong only because God was near. He whispered into the night, "Lord, Teach us to depend on you fully, not just in battle, but in every choice we make." And though mistakes had been made, Joshua knew God was still leading them. As long as they listened and stayed loyal, no wall would be too high, no enemy too strong, and no promise too far away. After the Gibeonites' trick, Joshua became even more careful to seek God before every move. As word of Israel's victories spread, 5 powerful kings in the south joined together. They decided to attack Gibeon first, furious that the city had made peace with Israel. When the Gibeonites heard the armies marching toward them, they sent messengers running to Joshua. "Come quickly," they cried. "Save us! Don't abandon your servants!" Joshua gathered his warriors without delay. This time, he didn't rely on guesses or quick decisions. He fell to his knees and prayed, "Lord, shall we go fight them? Will you give them into our hands?" God answered clearly in Joshua's heart, "Do not be afraid. I have delivered them into your hands. Not one of them will stand against you." Joshua jumped to his feet, fire in his eyes. He turned to his men. "We march tonight!" he shouted. Through the dark night, they moved swiftly and quietly, reaching Gibeon at dawn. The enemy kings were shocked to see Israel arrive so fast. Their soldiers panicked and started running in every direction. Joshua pointed his sword forward. "Charge! The Lord fights for us today." Israel chased the enemy through the valleys and hills. As they fled, God sent a sudden storm. Huge hailstones crashed down from the sky, striking the enemy soldiers. More died from hail than from swords that day. Joshua saw the sun starting to slide down the sky. He knew they needed more time to finish the battle, so, filled with faith, he looked up and cried out, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon over the valley of Aijalon." And to everyone's amazement, the sun stopped moving. The day stretched longer, giving Israel the time they needed to win completely. When the final sword fell silent, Joshua stood in the fading light, breathless and awestruck. "There has never been a day like it before," he whispered, "when God listened to a man like that." After these battles, the land finally began to quiet. Joshua gathered the leaders and began dividing the land among the tribes, just as God had commanded through Moses. He marked out the borders and gave each family a place to settle. The people celebrated, planting vineyards and building homes, finally living in the land they had waited for so long. At night, as families sat around small fires, they told stories about Jericho's walls falling, the sun standing still, and the river splitting. Joshua sat near his tent, watching them. He felt the warmth of the fire on his face, and the warmth of God's presence in his heart. He knew there would always be challenges, but in that moment, he felt the deep peace of a promise fulfilled. Years passed, and the land grew quiet. Vineyards covered the hills, olive trees swayed in the breeze, and children laughed as they played in fields that used to be battlefields. Joshua grew older. His hair turned white, his steps slowed, but his eyes still held the same fierce light they did when he first crossed the Jordan. One day he called all the leaders, elders, and families together at a place called Shechem. People gathered from every tribe, sitting on rocks and grassy slopes, waiting for Joshua to speak. He stood in front of them, leaning slightly on a staff, and looked over the crowd with deep love. "You have seen everything the Lord your God has done for you," he began, his voice strong despite his age. "It wasn't your swords or your strength that gave you this land. It was God who fought for you, who went before you, who never left your side." The people nodded, some with tears in their eyes. Fathers squeezed their sons' shoulders, and mothers held their daughters close. Joshua paused, taking a slow breath. "Now choose this day whom you will serve," he said, his voice ringing like a trumpet. "The gods your ancestors worshipped long ago, or the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, who split the river, who tore down walls?" A hush fell over the crowd. Then Joshua lifted his chin and pounded his staff on the ground. "As for me and my house," he declared, his voice shaking with emotion, "we will serve the Lord." A great shout rose up from the people, echoing across the fields. "We will serve the Lord," they cried back. "We will obey him forever." Joshua's eyes shone as he looked over the sea of faces. He saw the young warriors who had marched with him, now gray-haired. He saw children who had never known the wilderness, only the land of promise. He knew his time was almost done, but he felt no fear. He felt the deep satisfaction of a life given fully to God's plan. Later that evening, Joshua sat alone at the edge of the camp, looking at the stars. The same stars he had looked at when he was a young spy, dreaming of grapes and giants, and wondering if God's promises were really true. A small smile spread across his face. "You kept every promise," he whispered into the night. "You never failed us. Not once." And with that, Joshua leaned back, feeling the gentle wind on his face, and closed his eyes for the last time. His journey was over, but his story would live on. A story of courage that came not from swords or numbers, but from trusting God's presence above all else. Because in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.